They had been told the world outside could kill them. That the air beyond the farm rotted lungs and the sky itself burned men to ash. Their mother never shouted when she said it. She spoke softly, like she was describing the weather, like doom was something gentle that tucked itself into your bones and slept beside you. So the 5 boys listened. They stayed. They obeyed. Because when fear wears the face of the woman who tucks you in at night, you don't question it, you learn to thank it. The barn stood behind the house like something older than the land, its wood blackened not with age, but with secrets pressed so tight into it they seemed to breathe. The boys grew up beneath its beams, beneath her rules, beneath her eyes that never blinked long enough for hope to crawl in. She called it sanctuary. She called it salvation. She never called it what it really was. Inside, time didn't move the way it should have. Seasons changed somewhere far away, but the barn stayed the same, heavy, airless, always expectant. She kept them working, always working, as if the routine itself was a chain. No one laughed anymore. No one remembered how. They slept lightly, not from danger outside, but from the danger of what she planned to do in the coming years, the kind of danger you feel before it touches you, like thunder pressing on your chest before the lightning hits. Sometimes one of them would glance toward the horizon, toward the trees and the thin strip of sky visible beyond the fields. That sliver of blue looked like freedom, like something that could save them if they could only reach it. But every time they dreamed too long, she appeared behind them, quiet, watchful, reminding them in her sweet velvet voice how easily they could die if they ever tried to leave. They believed her. They trusted her. They never should have. Because the barn wasn't built to protect them. It was built to keep them. From the beginning, she learned that fear was easier to feed than love, and so she nurtured it carefully, spooning it into their minds like medicine until the boys could no longer tell whether they were being protected or imprisoned. She told them the outside world was diseased, that the wind carried sickness and the soil beyond their fences was tainted with something invisible that turned strong men weak and honest families into monsters. She spoke of towns collapsing, of children suffocating in streets, of neighbors sharpening knives to hunt anyone foolish enough to wander past the limits of safety. She said she had seen it all, that she had watched the world rot, and she alone had rescued them just in time. The barn became their boundary, the property line their entire horizon, and her word their only gospel. She locked the gates, sealed the doors at night, and made the woods feel like the edge of the universe, a place where shadows listened and waited for mistakes. Whenever curiosity sparked, she smothered it with stories of bodies found in ditches, of men begging to breathe air that no longer wanted them alive, of mothers who failed their children because they trusted the world instead of fearing it. And the boys, raised under her constant vigilance, began to see threats where there were none, danger in sunlight, doom in the simple concept of escape. Isolation wasn't only physical, she separated them from possibility, from dreams, from memory itself, convincing them they were chosen, sheltered, blessed, but also cursed to remain right where they were. Each locked door became proof of devotion. Each warning became a lullaby disguised as terror. They worked because she said it kept them strong. They stayed because she said leaving meant death. She wrapped their lives so tightly around her that even their breath felt borrowed, and the world beyond the fence stopped feeling real at all, becoming instead a myth of pain and ruin she repeated until it hardened into truth inside their heads, until even the strongest of them doubted his own instincts and believed that every heartbeat he still had was owed entirely to her. The barn did not reveal its secrets all at once. It seeped them into the boys' lives the way damp rot crawls through wood, slow and silent until it becomes impossible to ignore. At first, it was just rules, strange and precise ones that never made sense but were never to be questioned. Certain doors could never be opened unless she was present. Certain sections of the barn were forbidden entirely, marked by chains, heavy locks, and the kind of warnings that made their stomachs twist. She told them the rooms were unsafe, too fragile to enter, filled with hazards only she understood, but the more she insisted, the more those locked spaces felt less like protection and more like secrets holding their breath. The rules grew stranger as they grew older. Lights were to go out at certain hours even if no one was tired. They had to speak softly in certain corridors as though something behind the walls might be listening. She measured their movements, timed their chores, counted their steps like someone maintaining order in a laboratory rather than a home. Every surface seemed to have a purpose she refused to name. Every tool looked like it belonged to a future she had prepared long before they were old enough to recognize intent. They started noticing stains that didn't come from farm work, faint scratches on doors like someone had once begged to be let out, old bolts patched over with newer ones as if the barn had been made to hold more than animals. The smell was wrong too, not entirely foul, but layered with sterile sharpness beneath the earthy scent of hay, something too clean and too cold for a simple farm. Whenever they asked questions, she answered with long looks instead of explanations, with affection that felt rehearsed, with reassurances that sounded like they were spoken to keep something from unraveling rather than to comfort them. She would touch their faces, smile, and tell them they were safe here, safer than anywhere else, safer than anyone else would ever keep them, and the barn seemed to hum quietly with that promise, as if it was waiting for the moment when they finally understood that safe did not mean what they had always believed it meant, that safety inside these walls required obedience, silence, and acceptance of whatever she was slowly preparing them for, long before any of them realized they were not. Simply being sheltered but carefully positioned for a purpose the barn had always been built to fulfill. It happened on a night that should have been like any other, the air thick with the smell of dust and wood oil, the silence of the barn broken only by the low creak of beams settling in the dark. The eldest son had learned how to move without sound, how to make himself invisible in a place where privacy did not exist, and curiosity had become a quiet rebellion inside him. He followed her because something inside him whispered that the rules were not meant to protect them but to hide something far worse. She carried a lantern, its faint glow slicing through the dark like a blade, and for the first time he saw how her hands trembled when she believed no eyes were watching. She disappeared into one of the forbidden rooms and left the door cracked just enough for truth to spill through. He saw chains bolted not for animals but for people, restraints worn smooth by struggle, scribbled notes taped to the walls with names, dates, instructions he could barely comprehend, and a ledger filled with calculations that made his chest tighten with dread. There were traces of others, faint but undeniable, forgotten belongings, torn fabric, and a stale grief in the air as if the room itself remembered suffering. She moved through it with familiarity, not horror, adjusting things with care, humming softly like this place was part of her rather than something monstrous. In that moment, every story she had ever told cracked open. The world outside was not the enemy, the real danger was standing right there, living under the same roof, wearing the face of a caretaker. He understood then that she had been preparing them not for survival but for control, for a plan so deliberate it chilled his blood. The terror was not only in what he saw, but in what it meant about everything he had believed since childhood, every comforting word, every warning whispered like a prayer. When she turned suddenly, lantern light sweeping the walls, he ducked back just in time, heart pounding so violently he could hear it in his ears, knowing he had crossed an invisible threshold he could never return from, carrying a truth too heavy to set down and too dangerous to speak aloud, yet impossible now to keep buried inside him. The youngest was always the one who listened the hardest, not because he chose to but because the barn never seemed to leave him alone, its silence never truly silent, its shadows never completely still. At first it was faint, something he could almost blame on imagination, like the echo of a dream clinging to him after waking. A soft dragging sound behind the walls when the night stretched too long, a whispering murmur that rose and fell like breathing, too deliberate to be wind and too human to be the house settling. He would freeze where he stood, his pulse roaring in his ears, waiting for it to stop, convincing himself it had been nothing until it came again louder, closer, patient in a way that suggested it wasn't random at all. He told himself it must be animals, rats maybe, or something nesting in the beams, but animals didn't whisper his name. They didn't scratch slow and rhythmic like fingers tracing wood, like someone trying not to panic while trapped on the other side. Sometimes he pressed his ear against the planks and swore he could hear words he couldn't quite understand, breath trembling against the boards as if someone was trying desperately to speak without sound. He noticed gouges in the wood now, marks he had never paid attention to before, thin lines layered over each other like the signatures of desperation, and on one beam he found faint letters carved so shallow they were almost gone, letters that weren't any of their names. When he asked her about the noises, she smiled too quickly, too softly, brushing his hair back with a trembling hand and telling him barns made sounds, that old wood remembered storms, remembered weight, remembered the past in strange ways, and he should not let it frighten him. But the reassurance didn't reach her eyes, and it didn't touch the dread pooling in his stomach. The whispers grew bolder after that, the scratching more insistent, as though whatever lingered here had been waiting for one of them to notice, to acknowledge it existed. And once he did, the barn seemed to lean closer to him, its walls no longer just walls but thresholds guarding stories that had never been told, secrets pressed so tightly inside them that sometimes at night it felt like they were trying to claw their way back into the world. It happened on a day that began deceptively ordinary, soaked in routine and the quiet dread that had become part of daily life, until the sound of unfamiliar footsteps on gravel shattered the fragile stillness. A figure appeared at the edge of the property, hesitant yet determined, calling out in a voice that didn't belong to the world she had constructed for them. The boys froze, every lesson she had drilled into them screaming inside their heads that anyone from outside meant ruin, death, unspeakable danger. Yet the man's voice carried no threat, only concern and something like familiarity, as though he knew far more about this place than he should. Before the boys could speak, she arrived, faster than they had ever seen her move, her face stretched into a smile that looked wrong, like skin pulled too tightly over fear. Her voice turned sweet, calm, overly gentle as she insisted there was nothing here to see, that they were private, peaceful, safe, but her hands trembled and her eyes never left the stranger as if he held a key to everything she was desperate to keep buried. The man tried to push past politeness, saying names they didn't recognize, asking where certain people were, asking why the barn was always locked, why no one had visited in so long, and every word he spoke felt like a hammer striking cracks into the walls of the lies they had been living inside. She snapped then, her calm tearing open into raw panic, her voice sharp and frantic, ordering him to leave, threatening him with authorities she had always claimed no longer existed, while her sons watched the mask they had mistaken for love slip for the first time. The man didn't leave immediately, he looked at the boys, really looked, with a sorrow that chilled them, as if he saw something they didn't yet understand, something horrifying hidden in plain sight. When he finally walked away, it was not victory she showed but terror, locking every door twice, checking every window, pacing like a hunted animal while whispering to herself that they were not ready, that everything could still be ruined if they didn't obey, and for the first time the boys realized the world beyond might not be the monster she always warned them about, that the only person terrified of exposure was the one who claimed she was saving them. They found the truth not in confrontation, but in the quiet betrayal of discovery, in dust-covered boxes she had hidden in places she believed they would never think to search, tucked behind false panels and beneath rotting floorboards where secrets waited like buried bones. It began with a loose plank the eldest disturbed while trying to steady himself during another sleepless night, revealing a narrow space stuffed with notebooks, brittle photographs, letters tied in fraying ribbon, all smelling faintly of age and something mournful. They gathered around with trembling hands, opening pages filled with her handwriting, not the loving lists and gentle reminders they were used to seeing, but meticulous records of them, each son reduced to observations and plans, their strengths catalogued, their weaknesses underlined, every emotion they'd ever shown dissected like an experiment. There were dates marking milestones they hadn't even realized mattered, cruel calculations about behavior, obedience, future intentions for their lives, all written with chilling calm. The photographs were worse. Images of people they didn't recognize standing near the barn years before they were born, expressions hollow and resigned, then later photographs of themselves, watched from angles they never knew she had been lurking in, sleeping, working, smiling when they still knew how, every moment documented like possessions rather than children. One journal spoke not about raising sons but about shaping subjects, about creating dependence so complete they would never question, about a legacy she felt destined to fulfill, something she believed their blood owed her. They found letters that hinted other people once tried to stop her, pleas for help never sent, apologies unsent, followed by colder entries where she wrote about removing problems, containing risk, silencing curiosity. And threaded through it all was a vision she had built long before they took their first breaths, a future where their lives served a purpose they had never agreed to, a future that explained the locks, the rituals, the fear she fed them daily. Reading it was like watching the world tilt, like realizing the ground beneath them had never been solid, and for the first time they understood with sickening clarity that love had never been the language she spoke to them in, control had, and every tender moment had only ever been another step in a plan that had always been waiting for the right moment to close around them. The discovery didn't unite them the way strangers might imagine brothers would rally when truth finally splits open the world they thought they knew. Instead, it cracked them apart in jagged, dangerous ways, exposing every fracture she had quietly carved into them over the years. The eldest, burdened with the knowledge first and the weight of responsibility pressed into him since childhood, burned with a grim certainty that they had to act, that staying meant surrendering their lives to a fate already written in her careful, merciless hand. But another brother, the one who clung hardest to her softness, to the rare smiles and whispered reassurances, couldn't bring himself to accept that everything was manipulation, insisting they misunderstood, that there must be reasons, that love couldn't possibly be a mask so convincing. Arguments started as whispers in corners, then rose into harsh, shaking voices in the dark, each of them racing against fear and confusion while trying not to wake her, torn between loyalty and survival. The middle brothers were caught between instinct and conditioning, remembering punishments dressed as lessons, remembering how she made doubt feel like betrayal, yet unable to unsee the chains, the notes, the evidence of lives destroyed before theirs. Even the youngest, haunted by the whispers in the walls, didn't know whether to run or to hide, whether freedom was worth the terror of stepping into a world he had been taught to fear since his first breath. Every glance between them became suspicious, every hesitation dangerous, every moment soaked with the knowledge that one wrong move could doom them all. They began keeping secrets from each other the way they once kept them from her, forming quiet alliances, whispering plans that contradicted one another, some dreaming of escape, others begging to maintain order just a little longer. And somewhere in the house, as if she could sense the shift in the air, she lingered more often in doorways, watched them longer than she ever had before, her gaze sharpened, her smile slower to appear, as though the balance she spent years constructing had begun to shake beneath her feet while the boys stood trapped between faith and awakening, waiting for whichever side of them broke first. Control was never something she surrendered easily, and once she sensed their faith thinning, she tightened her grip with a precision that made it painfully clear she had always anticipated rebellion. The rules multiplied overnight, subtle freedoms they once took for granted vanishing one by one until their lives shrank to the size of the barn's walls. Doors that had once merely been watched were now bolted from the outside, windows nailed shut with fresh boards that still smelled of sap, the world beyond them reduced to muffled wind and fragments of sky they could no longer touch. She changed their schedules too, forcing them to wake earlier, to work longer, to stay within sight of one another as if the simple act of being alone might give them space to think dangerous thoughts. Her voice softened even as her actions hardened, every order wrapped in affection, every restriction disguised as care, reminding them that she only wanted to keep them safe, that the outside world was circling closer, that danger was waiting and she would not let it take them. But now they could see the fear wasn't for them, it was for herself, and that realization made every gentle word feel like a chain. She collected anything that could open, break, pry, or cut, sweeping tools from their hands under the pretense of organization and locking them away in places she alone could reach. Night became the worst time, because instead of rest, it brought inspections, footsteps outside locked doors, the flicker of light beneath thresholds as she checked and counted like a warden ensuring her prisoners remained where they belonged. She began separating them, pairing them strategically, never letting certain brothers stay together long enough to whisper too much, praising obedience in one while punishing hesitation in another, turning them into examples for each other the way she had in the journals they found. Even the barn changed, not physically but in atmosphere, growing heavier with enforced silence, with unspoken terror, with the understanding that whatever she was building toward was no longer distant or theoretical but dangerously close, and the more tightly she controlled them, the more the air itself felt like it belonged to her, as if even breathing without permission might one day be taken away. The storm arrived like a warning, first as a distant rumble over the hills, then as wind clawing at the roof, shaking the barn until the boys felt the building itself might crumble around them. Rain hammered the tin in sheets, a relentless drumming that erased the world beyond their walls and forced them together in the cramped, suffocating space they had once thought safe. She moved among them with practiced calm, though even her steady hands shook slightly as she adjusted locks, checked windows, and made sure no corner was left unobserved. The power she had wielded for years seemed absolute in the roar of the storm, and yet the very violence outside mirrored the tension within, a reckoning pressed into every heart. Trapped together with nowhere to run, the boys could no longer hide from one another or from the truth they had all discovered in fragments over time. Accusations, fears, and desperate questions spilled out, voices overlapping, trembling, and cracking under the weight of long-suppressed knowledge. Each one revealed what they had seen, what they had suspected, what they had begun to understand about the mother who had raised them in fear and obedience. She tried to reassert control, her voice rising above the storm with words that had once seemed like comfort but now felt like chains tightening around their throats, yet the unity forming among the brothers could not be undone. The eldest took the lead, steadying them even as panic and guilt clawed at his chest, forcing them to listen to each other, to see each other not as extensions of her plan but as humans capable of decision, capable of resistance. The youngest, whose ears had always caught the whispers of the barn, now heard them differently, no longer as voices meant to frighten but as echoes of warning and guidance, a map of survival layered into the timbers around them. The storm pressed against every wall, every board, and the boys pressed against one another, combining courage, rage, and despair in a shared recognition that the time for waiting, for fear disguised as obedience, was over. Every gust, every flash of lightning, every crack of thunder became punctuation in a night that demanded action, forcing them to confront her not as mother, not as authority, but as the architect of their imprisonment, and to reconcile the lessons of fear she had instilled with the determination to survive, to reclaim their lives from a fate they had never chosen. The moment came not with careful planning or quiet resolution, but with a raw, inevitable surge of desperation that could no longer be contained. The storm had passed, leaving the barn dripping and trembling like something still breathing, the air thick with the scent of wet hay, sweat, and fear. The boys faced her at last, their eyes no longer children's eyes that sought approval, but sharp and unflinching, reflecting the years of manipulation and control she had imposed upon them. She tried first with reason, then with pleading, then with threats, each effort more frantic, more unhinged than the last, but the fragile barrier that had kept them loyal cracked irreparably in that instant. Their anger and terror collided, a single, chaotic wave of resistance that she had never anticipated, born not just from the discovery of her lies but from the accumulation of decades spent in silent observation, in whispered dread, in the quiet recognition that the person they had been told to trust above all else, had been shaping them into something they never chose to become. They moved with a combination of caution and fury, testing her, pushing back, daring her to respond, and when she struck to reassert control, it only strengthened their resolve, turning fear into strategy, panic into focus. The barn, long a vessel of her power, became the arena where every secret she had kept, every chain she had hidden, every rule she had enforced in the name of protection, erupted into confrontation. Screams echoed off beams that had borne witness to silent suffering for years, the air thick with the sound of rage and defiance, each movement a negotiation of life and death. In the chaos, they discovered a strength they had never been allowed to claim, a unity forged not from comfort but from shared suffering, and each act of rebellion chipped away at the control she had wielded so meticulously. By the end, the barn was transformed, not physically but spiritually, from prison to testament, a place that bore the weight of what had been endured and what had been reclaimed. The final moments left a lingering uncertainty, as if the question of who truly had power remained unresolved, for even in victory there was a shadow of her influence, a hint that the lessons she had forced upon them, the lessons of fear, obedience, and manipulation, might not be so easily shed, and that survival carried with it the memory of darkness so complete that it could still shape the future in ways they could not yet see.